Okay, at the end of the last video, I was saying that I had some extra words in here that I don't need here, but I actually need them up here. So I'll go ahead, copy them up here first, then get rid of them. Whoops, I almost got rid of them in the wrong spot. Get rid of them right there. And because I know I can regain that brightness with the controls, I'll just go ahead and do an F6 here, F6 here. And it's from here to here that I want the brightness to go back up. So I'll click on this keyframe to select this, go over to my color effects, which brought me back in there just by grabbing the selection tool, and put this back at 0. In fact, it might be easier just to type a 0 in there, and then we can go back here, right click, and remove that tween. Okay, so our next task is to animate the alpha, also known as the opacity, down. So clicking on frame 780, going into, and see, like right now it's showing us properties for the actual tweening. So if we click on the selection tool and click on here, now it'll show us with the things that we can do to that instance. So once again, we want the color effect, and instead of brightness this time we're going to choose alpha. And then we're going to slide alpha all the way down to 0, so our animation looks something like that. And we've got text here and a copy of the text here. So we'll go back here, remove the words that we don't need. And then come back here, do our F6s. And from here to here, we want the opacity to come back up. So once again, we need to make a selection in here, go to the alpha, and this time we're going to crank it back up. Get rid of our tween there. Extend our text, and we're good with that next step. And there's of course two things that you should be doing as you're working through this animation, and that is in addition to just dragging the playhead to make sure that everything's working as it should. You should be previewing it. Before you do that, I would suggest you go ahead and keep saving your work a lot, but doing the command return and making sure that everything makes sense here, that it says what it's going to do just before it does it, and that there's no surprises. If there is, that's where your troubleshooting skills come in, and my help, of course, if you need it. From 840 to 860, we are going to be animating the tint. And so we go here, we go to tint, and in the example I used green. Tint is pretty powerful. If you go 100% of the tint, it basically changes that instance of that symbol to just be a solid color. And we just went to 80% just so you could still make it out. So there's our animation there. And our last animation in this section is to go back to removing the tint. Now, this is kind of a small detail, but since this is the last bit of text that shows up in here, rather than doing an F6 here, we'll just do an F5. And the difference is that instead of actually making a physical copy, you're just extending. Uses a little bit less memory. And then I just went back and looked at the Swift file, and it looks like it just extends for 2 more seconds after everything is finished here. So that would take us out to frame 920, 940. So we'll just swipe across there, hit the F5 key, get rid of the tween here. And in fact, where a tween doesn't make sense, you get these little dashed lines because you have to tween classic tween from one keyframe to another, and since there is no keyframe here, it shows you these dashed lines. So if ever you see that, as opposed to the arrow, you know you've got an error. But in our case, it's just a matter of removing the tween. So there we go. Preview the video, test it out, but you've got the first part, well, the second section finished. Now we'll talk about creating a unique intro part. Now I just compared the video that I just created, the Swift file, to the Swift file that I provided you with, and realized that there was a couple areas that the timing is off. And what happens is that each time it comes up to a frame like this where it says I option drag from the last frame back, I actually made those 2 seconds. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we'll just go back to the beginning of our animation by clicking here, and we'll just drag through it, or we can use the period key. Just hold that down until we see one of those. And what we're going to do is just use the F5 key to insert a second basically in there. Okay, so right here is one of them. Now it's important that we select both frames, so I'm going to drag across, and rather than counting the number of times that I click the F5 key, I can just watch this frame here and stop when it arrives there. So holding down F5, I'm going to lift it off and now just tap it. And it looks like that frame's on 240. If I click on it, nope, it's actually on 241, so I went one frame too far. So I'll click and drag across, hold down the Shift key, and do an F5. And then I'm just going to repeat what I just did. Every time I get one of these that talks about option dragging, I'm going to insert a second's worth of time in there. And here's another one. So I want to get this into better view. Drag across, hold down F5 until I move that frame out, test it by clicking on it, it's exactly where it should be, and so on. So after making all the updates to those sections, my animation now concludes at frame 1020. So now we're finally up to the part of the project where you get to have fun and be creative. So you will create an addition to the animation that you just made that's 8 to 12 seconds long. We'll call it an introduction, and the only requirement I have is that it just consists of classic tweening as words and letters. So let's go take a look at mine, and there it is right there. And you are not responsible for these buttons. I just put these in here to help you. You can also use the control features by going, in fact, rewind is nice because it brings you right back to the very beginning and stops it. And then you can either use my play button or the play under here. So this is where, again, you get to be totally creative. If you look at mine, the word classic just kind of fades in. Yours, the letters could shoot in from the bottom, top, sides. The whole word could come sliding in. You notice I didn't experiment with color here. So think of everything that you just completed in your animation and pick a few that fascinated you or that you just envision in your mind as making a very interesting introduction to this topic. So I'm mainly just using scale changes here to make it look like the things are jumping out at you. There was one rotation here and then tweening just jumped in, and before you know it, your 8 to 12 seconds is over and you're back to the main chunk of the animation. So the first thing we have to deal with in Flash is how do we insert some time. So I'm at the very end of my video. To speed things up, I'm going to click here. Will jump me back to the very beginning, and there's a couple different ways you can address this. If we just needed to move a short section of video, we can click on the first frame and then shift click on the last frame, but in this case that's probably a little bit more cumbersome, but luckily there's only 2 layers worth of information. So now I'm shift clicking, I have the whole thing selected, and then I could click and drag over enough seconds. That's a pretty efficient way of doing this, but I'm going to Command Z back that up because let me show you another way just in case we had a whole bunch of information and multiple layers and so on. So what I can do is just drag across here, hit or push F5 enough to start to give me some space. Now what that really does is extends this frame, but then I can say, in fact, let me get it to like a number, like where this shows up at 80. It'll make our math a little bit easier. So I'll keep F5ing until this first keyframe shows up at frame 80 and double checking, yeah, it is 80. If not, I could shift F5, remove a frame, F5 to add some more frames. But now what I'm going to do is take these 2 frames, so click, shift click, and I'm going to drag them over to frame 60. And then now that gives me my blank at the beginning, and then all I have to do is drag across here and keep F5ing until I get about 12 seconds away. And remember, we're at, in our properties, we're at 20 frames per second, so 12 seconds would be 12 times 20, which is 240. So I'll go the full 240, even though you could do as little as 8 seconds worth of animation, but I can always remove those frames if I need to. So I'm just going to keep on F5ing and moving over so I can see what's going on until that first keyframe is approximately 240 frames. So that's close enough. We can always add or delete frames later on. Then we'll just click here, take us back to the beginning, and start our animation. There are a couple issues that will come up when trying to tween text individually, especially. So I'm going to Command C, copy this, come back into Flash, grab the text tool, paste that in, and I'll take the free transform tool and I'll move this text in. Now, the thing you have to remember here is that every time you do a classic tween, what you're working with needs to be a symbol. So after all the effort you put in and all the learning that you did, keep track of your library. So watch things like this. If let's say I wanted this text to spin around at the beginning. So I go here, do a F6, right click and put in my classic tween. Now look what just happened, garbage in the library. So let's back up, and the problem is even if you back up doing Command Z, the garbage stays in the library. So we have to select it, get rid of it, and if you wait like down the road to get rid of that garbage, it'll affect what you've done out here on the timeline. So always keep an ID on that library, kind of go back in between properties in the library. Every time you do a tween until you get really good at this, look at the library to make sure you didn't goof up. So what you want to do here is you would convert this into a symbol. So you just simply go back to the frame that it exists on, select it, do your F8, and then give it an appropriate name, because I will be looking to see that you named every symbol that's in your library. And then we can go ahead and make our tween. And we could be as simple as just doing a rotation. Now, if you want to affect individual letters like I did, we'll pick up with that on the next video.